Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a university student who returned home from the library and was never seen again. Right from the start of the investigation, there were numerous unsettling, strange, and even shocking details, which eventually led to a change in state law. But despite all this, the truth remained unknown for decades, and it wasn't until 2024 that the case was finally solved. Tara Baker was born on January 20th, 1977 in East Point, Georgia. Her parents divorced when she was young, and sometime later, her mother remarried. Tara had two brothers and a sister, making her the oldest of four. From a very young age, Tara showed a keen interest in the legal system and wanted to become either a lawyer or a judge. She would hold trials with her stuffed animals, make legal contracts with her relatives, and often write letters to various politicians. Once, she even wrote to the President of the United States and complained that his speech had interrupted her favorite TV show. After graduating high school, Tara attended Georgia College. She graduated early, in just 3 years, earning 2 bachelor degrees. In 1999, Tara enrolled at the University of Georgia to complete her education. This university was one of the top law schools in the country and was located in a small town called Athens, just a few hours' drive from her parents' home. So it was the perfect choice for Tara. She didn't want to live in a dorm again after college, so she decided to rent off-campus housing instead. She chose a house split into 3 separate rooms for rent. 2 other university students rented the other rooms, one of whom Tara knew well from college. For some time, Tara worked at a prestigious law firm in downtown Athens, which allowed her not only to cover rent and other expenses, but also to gain valuable experience in her future profession. In January 2001, when Tara was 23 and in her second year, she spent a lot of time studying at the university library. The evening of January 18th was no exception. She, along with her friend, went to the library and spent several hours there. Her friend left for home around 7:30 p.m., while Tara decided to stay longer. At approximately 9:46 p.m., she called her friend from the library to check if she had gotten home safely. Tara also mentioned that she planned to head home in a few minutes. The next day, around 6 p.m., her mother, Virginia Baker, received a phone call. At first, she thought someone was playing a prank on her because the caller identified themselves as a detective and asked if her daughter had ever been arrested, as they needed her fingerprints. Thinking it was a joke, Virginia hung up, but then she decided to call the Athens police station. To her surprise, they confirmed that she had indeed spoken to a real detective and informed her that there had been a fire at Tara's house. Still not fully understanding what was going on, Virginia asked to speak to her daughter. The detective replied that they couldn't find her and that an unidentified body had been found in the house, which was why they needed Tara's fingerprints. The detective further explained that they had only been able to locate one of Tara's roommates, who was not home at the time of the fire. The whereabouts of the other roommate and Tara were still unknown, and investigators believed that the body might belong to one of them. Virginia then asked to describe the room where the body was found. The detective's response left her speechless. They said that the room was filled with antique stuff, and Tara had been collecting such items for years. Tara's family immediately drove to Athens, hoping it was all just a misunderstanding and that Tara was okay. When they arrived at the police station, they were kept waiting for a long time without any information. Several hours later, a detective finally informed them that the body found in the house belonged to Tara and that she had been murdered, not killed in the fire. The detective then said he was too tired to answer their questions. Before leaving, he added that Tara had left them a gift. Under her nails, experts had found fragments of the perpetrator's skin, which might help identify him. Tara's relatives, shocked by the news of her murder, were left in confusion and despair. Despite their pleas for more information, the police did not provide any further details. The family desperately tried to get some answers, but detectives continued to refuse to share any information with them. Since then, the local police department has never contacted the family, and Tara's relatives had to beg for any information by calling and visiting the station over and over again. They eventually managed to piece together some of what had happened. Around 11 a.m. on January 19th, firefighters were called to Tara's address. After extinguishing the fire, they found a body inside, later identified as Tara Baker. Medical experts concluded that Tara had been murdered. Her body showed signs of strangulation and stab wounds, and she had likely been assaulted. The fire had started after her death, leading investigators to believe that the perpetrator set it to destroy evidence. However, Tara's parents were never able to get the police to show them the medical examiner's report or provide detailed information about the murder. Tara's family also learned that many pieces of evidence might have been destroyed by the firefighters, which is not uncommon in such cases. Their primary goal was to extinguish the blaze and potentially rescue any survivors, and they couldn't have known that there was a murder victim inside. The family also discovered that the investigators likely didn't secure the house after finding the body, allowing anyone to approach or even enter the crime scene. As Tara's relatives gathered these pieces of information, they not only encountered the police's reluctance to keep them informed about the investigation, but also faced constant rudeness and unprofessionalism. At one point, they even started recording their conversations with the police and filed complaints against the local investigators. But this led nowhere. They eventually decided to conduct their own investigation and reached out to a well-known criminologist who agreed to help them. However, the local police department agreed to show him the case materials only on the condition that he would not share any information or findings with anyone outside the investigation, including Tara's relatives. The family hadn't been able to obtain Tara's death certificate for 10 years. It was only after writing to the state governor that they finally received the document. But even then, the detailed cause of death was not listed. It simply stated multiple injuries. Despite all this, the police did continue their investigation, although there were many questionable moments in their actions, which we'll discuss a bit later. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered Tara's body, they called the police. Realizing it was a murder, investigators searched for evidence at the crime scene, but the room was severely damaged by fire and water. As the family later found out, some surviving items were never examined for fingerprints. The police were able to determine that Tara's laptop was missing from her room. Considering it was 2001, the laptop was quite a bulky piece of tech, yet no other valuable items were taken. This raised doubts about the robbery gone wrong motive. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that Tara might have known her killer and let them in voluntarily. Although the fire and firefighting efforts had damaged the crime scene so much that it was difficult to be certain. Both of Tara's roommates were out of town that evening, so she was home alone. Establishing the time of death was challenging, so medical experts estimated a time frame from 10 p.m., when Tara left the library, to 11 a.m., when neighbors called the fire department. The crime likely occurred closer to the morning hours, since the fire didn't need much time to spread. The police also found witnesses who saw a middle-aged white man running down the street that morning. He was only wearing a t-shirt and jeans, which was odd given the fact it was winter. They soon found out about a phone call to Tara's university a few days before the murder. The university had a number for requesting student information, like phone numbers, which was used by students themselves or faculty. A man, sounding heavily intoxicated, called and asked for Tara Baker's phone number. He only managed to write it correctly on the 8th attempt. While this was highly suspicious, the man's identity was never determined. At the time of her murder, Tara had a boyfriend who became a person of interest from the very beginning. He provided an alibi that was confirmed, yet the police were reluctant to remove him from their list of suspects. Even after verifying his alibi, they treated him with suspicion, calling him and his parents in the middle of the night and demanding that he come to the station in another city to provide additional biological samples, answer questions, or undergo a polygraph test. It's worth mentioning that it was Tara's boyfriend who had to identify her. He lived in another city and came to Athens immediately upon hearing about the fire. Although Tara's parents were already in town, the police asked the boyfriend to identify her. They brought him directly to the house, but he wasn't allowed inside. Instead, a police officer went in, took a photograph of the body, and showed it to him on the camera screen. Shocked, he said he couldn't be sure if it was Tara. He then mentioned that he had given her earrings, and if he saw them, he could be certain. The officer went back inside, removed the earrings from the body, and showed them to him. Only after that, the boyfriend confirmed they belonged to Tara. The police soon focused their attention on another individual, a student who attended the same classes as Tara and had a troubling reputation. Several female students came forward, saying that he repeatedly asked various girls out on dates and often didn't take no for an answer. He had also asked Tara out multiple times, even though she had been telling him that she had a boyfriend. Some girls also mentioned that this person scared them with his creepy behavior and made them feel uncomfortable. Detectives began to investigate him, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to the crime. At one point, they even asked Tara's friends to keep an eye on him, which was a quite controversial move, but it led nowhere. Another suspect was an attorney who worked at the same company as Tara. Talking to her colleagues, investigators found out that shortly before the murder, the man began acting quite strangely. In their company, there was a close-knit group of employees who socialized outside of work pretty often. At some point, this attorney suddenly quit their group. Moreover, just a few days before the incident, he told Tara that he wouldn't be able to attend her birthday celebration, which was scheduled for the day after the murder. On the morning of January 19th, before the fire started, one of Tara's colleagues decided to try and convince him to come to the celebration, since Tara considered him a good friend, and she was hurt by his sudden decision. The colleague went to his office, but he wasn't there. Considering that his workday had already begun, this was strange. He had always been present at the office in the mornings, but on that particular day, it wasn't the case. The colleague also checked his work schedule, thinking he might have meetings, but it was empty. He didn't show up that day, but the next day, he went to another colleague's house and behaved quite strangely. Many people who knew him suspected that he regularly used illicit substances, which could have explained his behavior. But there was more. The colleague noticed several fresh scratches on his neck. As we remember, skin particles from the perpetrator were found under Tara's nails, which meant that she had probably scratched her attacker. The attorney claimed he was scratched by a cat and denied any involvement in Tara's murder. However, when asked who he thought committed the crime, he acted quite oddly. He started shouting that it was her father, but provided no explanation to support this claim. Another weird thing was that the attorney suddenly resigned just a few months after the murder and left the state. It's unknown whether the police compared his DNA with the samples found under the victim's nails. Moreover, for all these years, there has been no information about whether these samples were even examined. Like with all other parts of the investigation, detectives didn't share any information, not even with Tara's relatives. The police later found out that the attorney was secretly dating two female colleagues from the company, despite being married. This could have explained his strange behavior and absence from work without apparent reasons. Both of these women also claimed they were sure he was using illegal substances. The police weren't able to find any evidence linking him to the murder, and eventually they stopped considering him a suspect. Detectives also looked into the employees of the maintenance company associated with the house where Tara rented a room. They had spare keys, which could have explained the absence of signs of forced entry, but they couldn't find any leads there either. Since then, there had been no significant progress in the case. The police continued to search for new suspects and witnesses while keeping most details of the investigation in secret, insisting that releasing such information could harm their efforts. Over time, they received several more potential leads. One witness reported seeing an African-American man outside Tara's house a few hours before the fire. Another mentioned seeing blood on a university classmate's notebook shortly after the murder. Police investigated both leads, but they didn't lead anywhere. Tara's parents raised $27,000 and offered it as a reward for any information that could help solve the case. Over the years, almost all detectives working on the case changed. The new team continued their efforts to crack the case, but there were no new breakthroughs. The main issue was the lack of evidence, as the fire and the firefighters' actions destroyed almost everything inside Tara's room that could have been of interest to the investigation. In 2020, 19 years after Tara's murder, a podcast emerged, shedding light on her case. Alongside Tara's family and other people involved in the case, this podcast gathered all available information about the crime, sparking a new wave of interest. The police department also took notice of the podcast, leading to increased communication between the new detectives and Tara's family. Thanks to that, the police began working on the case more thoroughly, but there was still no progress. The podcast episodes dedicated to Tara aired for 2 years, significantly impacting the fate of the case. It became one of the reasons why Georgia's government came up with a bill aimed at reducing the number of unsolved cases in state. This bill was named after Tara and another young woman from Georgia whose murder remained unsolved. 18-year-old Rhonda Coleman was found dead in 1990, and her killer has not been found to this day. Even though Rhonda's murder was clearly unrelated to Tara's death, it was decided to name this initiative the Coleman-Baker Bill. In 2023, the bill unanimously passed, and the governor of Georgia came to Athens to sign it in the presence of the families of both victims. The law aimed to establish an unsolved cases unit within the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. It also empowered the family of the victims to request the police to review unsolved cases, re-examine evidence, and take other steps to solve them. As soon as the law was signed in 2023, such a unit was established, specifically focusing on Tara's murder. Detectives reviewed all available information and began examining the few pieces of evidence, utilizing modern DNA analysis tools. This went on for several months, until May 13, 2024, when the police called a press conference. After 23 years since the murder, they announced that the perpetrator had finally been arrested. The culprit turned out to be a 48-year-old man named Edric Faust. During the conference, investigators didn't disclose how exactly they identified the suspect, only mentioning that modern DNA analysis tools and other biological evidence played a crucial role. They refrained from revealing all details to avoid compromising the ongoing legal proceedings, and only at trial would they disclose what evidence they have against Faust. In Faust's arrest documents, among other charges, he was accused of assaulting the victim, so his biological material could have matched the DNA sample from Tara's body. As we also recall, traces of the assailant's skin were found under the victim's nails, and it's possible that modern tools allowed experts to extract the killer's DNA from it. As for Faust, he likely should have been in the FBI database for a long time due to his extensive criminal record, including numerous arrests for various offenses. At the time of Tara's murder, he was 25 and living in the same city. However, police stated they couldn't find any evidence indicating the suspect knew the victim, suggesting Faust might have broken into her home or convinced her to let him in under some pretext. Detectives also revealed that Faust had never been a suspect in the case and only came under their radar a few days before his arrest, thanks to innovative DNA analysis methods. At the moment, Faust remains in jail awaiting trial, and only during the process will we learn what evidence the police were able to find against him. Apparently, detectives did obtain indisputable DNA evidence, as Faust was denied bail. They have no doubt that Faust is responsible for Tara's murder, so her case is officially closed. Tara's family, who fought for the truth for 23 years, finally learned what happened to her and thanked the new team of detectives for bringing closure to the case. As for Rhonda Coleman, the other woman after whom the law was named, her case remains unsolved. However, her family can now hope that detectives will discover new evidence and hold the culprit accountable, as it happened in Tara's case.
Sarah Williamson was born on June 20, 1963, in Florida. Her father served in the Army, so for a time, the family lived on a military base before eventually settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At school, Sarah stood out right away, especially in math. It later turned out her IQ was exceptionally high, and she earned top grades with very little effort. She also loved to read, gravitating towards crime novels, and by her later high school years, she was already thinking about writing one of her own. She was also energetic and outgoing, had plenty of friends, and loved spending time with her older sister. After graduating, she enrolled at a university not far from Albuquerque and earned a degree in mathematics. While she was studying, she met a man named Cohen, and once they both finished their degrees, they got married. Sarah had planned to continue on to a master's in statistics, but she received a very attractive job offer at a military base. After working there for a while, she and her husband moved to Maryland, where she landed a position as a statistical analyst with the National Security Agency. It was a major leap in her career, and Sarah quickly proved herself as a talented problem solver who could take on challenges of any size. Around that same time, she began writing her own crime novel about a statistician who solves a murder. 3 years into her marriage, Sarah's relationship with her husband started to fall apart, and eventually they decided to get a divorce. She kept working at the NSA and also decided to finally pursue her master's in statistics. Sarah enrolled in evening classes at Johns Hopkins University, where she met another student named Lorenzo. At the time, she was 27 and he was 25. Lorenzo was working towards a degree in business and finance, and like Sarah, he had already been married once before. The two started dating, and after Sarah completed her master's, she married him. They settled in a well-off neighborhood called Elkridge, just outside Baltimore. 3 years later, they had a son, but almost immediately after his birth, Lorenzo began to pull away from the family. His behavior changed drastically. He became controlling of Sarah's every move and showed almost no interest in their child. Eventually, Sarah decided to file for divorce. Lorenzo moved back in with his parents, who lived nearby, and they agreed their son would spend weekends with him while living with Sarah the rest of the time. At the time, Sarah was 35, and her son had just turned 1. On Friday, November 13, 1998, she dropped him off at Lorenzo's house, then spent the next day with her best friend Laura. The following morning, Sunday, Laura woke up expecting a call from Sarah because they had planned to talk, but Sarah never called. Laura tried contacting her, but she didn't answer. That's when Laura noticed she had a voicemail waiting. It had been left at 8:46 p.m. the night before, while she was already asleep. Back then, voicemail didn't show who had called unless you dialed in to listen. Still, Laura figured it might be from Sarah and pressed play. To her horror, she heard chaos on the line, strange noises, then a woman screaming, followed by the sounds of a violent struggle. It sounded like someone was being attacked in real time. Shaken, Laura immediately contacted police. She asked them to check on Sarah, and officers were dispatched to her home. The first thing they noticed was that the window next to the front door had been shattered, yet the door itself was locked, and no one came when they knocked. Circling around, they found the sliding glass door at the back unlocked and went inside. What stood out immediately was that the alarm system on that door was still armed, which made little sense. If someone had broken in through the front, the alarm should have gone off. When they entered the living room, they were met with a gruesome sight. Sarah's body lay sprawled on the floor in a massive pool of blood. The walls, furniture, even the ceiling were also splattered with it. Fearing the worst, officers hurried through the rest of the house, searching for Sarah's baby. Not knowing he was with his father, they immediately assumed he might have been kidnapped. Sarah's body was sent to the medical examiner, while detectives focused on processing the crime scene. They quickly determined that the killer had most likely entered through the broken front window. That window was also wired to the alarm system, but the sensor was on the frame, so it would only trigger if the window was opened. Smashing the glass didn't set it off. Bloody fingerprints showed that the intruder also used the same window to leave. Inside, investigators noticed something strange. Someone had pulled out all the VHS tapes from a drawer in the living room and scattered them across the floor, and the VCR itself was missing. In the kitchen, every cabinet door had been thrown open, like someone was searching for something specific. At first glance, it looked like a burglary, but detectives quickly started to doubt that theory. Sarah's laptop and wallet were sitting untouched on the kitchen table. It felt more like someone had staged the scene to look like a break-in, covering up a much darker motive. The autopsy only reinforced that suspicion. Sarah had been stabbed repeatedly, with wounds across her entire body. The sheer level of violence suggested deep, personal anger or hatred toward her. Detectives also couldn't figure out why the killer chose to smash the front window. The back of the house faced the woods and would have offered a much safer way in without drawing attention. That led them to believe the attacker might have known exactly how the alarm system worked and realized that breaking the back door glass would have likely triggered it. Forensics didn't find any usable fingerprints or solid evidence. All they could do was gather up the huge amounts of blood left behind, hoping that somewhere in the mess they might pick up traces of the killer's DNA, if he'd cut himself during the brutal attack. Meanwhile, officers searched the backyard and discovered a machete, which they believed was the murder weapon. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds on Sarah's body matched it exactly. While experts worked through the evidence, detectives confirmed that Sarah's little boy was safe with his father. With that worry off the table, they turned their focus to interviewing Sarah's friends and family. They wanted to know if she'd had any conflicts leading up to her death, but everyone said the same thing. Sarah was kind, easygoing, and never fought with anyone. The only exception was her ex-husband, Lorenzo. Sarah's best friend Laura explained to investigators that the divorce had been rough. After their son was born, Lorenzo's behavior completely changed. He had been on antidepressants before, but stopped taking them once the baby arrived. From then on, Sarah noticed he showed no interest in spending time with her son. But that wasn't all. Lorenzo also grew controlling, watching her every move. Over time, Sarah started to feel like he was angry at her for giving more attention to their newborn than to him. Sometime later, after Sarah went back to work, Lorenzo started accusing her of having an affair with her boss. He even showed up at her workplace. Since she worked for the NSA, his accusations triggered a full-scale internal investigation and interviews with dozens of employees. In the end, investigators found absolutely no evidence to back up his claims. Still, Lorenzo refused to let it go. During one of their fights, he even pulled a gun on Sarah. That was the breaking point, and she filed for divorce. When Lorenzo found out about it, he tried to hit her while she was holding their baby. Sarah fell, and Lorenzo snatched the child and walked out. He dropped the baby off at his parents' house, then came back and told Sarah she had to sleep with him, or she'd never see her son again. After that, Sarah went straight to the police and got a restraining order against him, but no other action was taken. From then on, she only saw him in court, where they were battling over custody, or when she dropped their son off at Lorenzo's parents' house on weekends, since the court ruled he had visitation rights. At one point, Lorenzo even tried to get a passport for his son so he could take him out of the country, but the court shut that down. Sarah's sister later revealed that just one day before the murder, Sarah had called her and said she was genuinely afraid of Lorenzo. She was worried he might hurt her before the court made a final decision about custody of their son. Sarah even asked her sister to look after the child if anything ever happened to her, because she didn't want Lorenzo raising him. That alone was enough for detectives to take a closer look at Lorenzo, so they went to speak with him. When they told him Sarah had been found dead, he dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and started screaming. Once he calmed down, investigators began asking questions. Lorenzo denied any involvement and insisted they should look into her boss, claiming Sarah had been having an affair with him. As for himself, he said he was at home that night, and his whole family backed him up. Detectives knew that kind of alibi wasn't rock solid. Family members could easily be covering for him. They took his DNA and fingerprints, and also checked him for any scratches that might have come from a struggle, but he didn't have a single mark on him. They then got a warrant to search Lorenzo's house and car, but once again, came up empty. No blood, no shoes matching the prints left in Sarah's house, and no other evidence that could tie him to the crime. In the end, Lorenzo hired a strong defense attorney, which forced detectives to shift their focus. They decided to check out Sarah's former boss, but by then he had already left the NSA and moved away. When the NSA learned about Sarah's murder, they decided to assign their own team to investigate the case alongside local police. They reached out to Sarah's former boss, and once again, he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. He also said that on the night of the murder, he was having dinner with friends in another state, and that alibi checked out. With no other real leads, detectives tried to squeeze more information out of the voicemail Sarah had left her friend in the middle of the attack. They were hoping to catch the killer's voice, but instead, they picked up something else. After experts cleaned up the recording, investigators thought they could hear Sarah screaming the name Mike. That immediately raised a red flag, because Lorenzo's brother was named Michelangelo, but he went by Mike. He lived in the same house with Lorenzo and their parents, and according to him, he'd been home the night Sarah was killed. Detectives started wondering if Mike might have carried out the murder himself, maybe to make sure the child stayed in their family. They brought him in for questioning and played the enhanced tape for him, but he said he couldn't hear his name on it at all. And to be fair, the theory was shaky from the start, because even on the cleaned up version, the recording was so unclear that you couldn't make out any distinct words. Mike denied having anything to do with the murder, but during questioning, detectives noticed he was visibly shaking. And when they drove him back home, the moment he stepped out of the car, he immediately threw up. It all looked suspicious, so the lead detective gave him his phone number and told him to call if he ever decided to come clean. But instead, Lorenzo's attorney reached out to police and said that from now on, they'd only be allowed to speak to his brother in the presence of a lawyer. After that, detectives checked out Sarah's first husband as well as Lorenzo's ex-wife, but both were cleared. As for Lorenzo's ex-wife, investigators asked if she'd be willing to help them, and she agreed. Police tapped her phone, and she called Lorenzo, carefully trying to coax something new out of him, but he stuck to his original story and kept insisting he had no idea who killed Sarah. There was also another theory tied to Sarah's job at the NSA. She had access to classified information, and detectives couldn't rule out that this might have been a motive. But the special team from the NSA looked into it and ultimately concluded there was no connection between her work and the crime. A month after the murder, the lab finally finished processing all the evidence from Sarah's house, and they found DNA from an unidentified man in 3 different blood samples. Detectives immediately compared it to Lorenzo's DNA, and to their surprise, it wasn't a match. The same went for his brother and his father. The blood didn't belong to any of them. This twist shocked investigators, who had been almost certain Lorenzo was involved. But now, with the DNA pointing to a completely different man, his guilt didn't look so clear anymore. The problem was, without any other leads, there was no way to figure out who the real killer was, and the case went cold for months. Detectives kept digging, even checking known serial offenders in the area, but nothing came of it. Later, they sent the voicemail recording to the FBI, where experts were able to clean it up more effectively. Turned out, Sarah hadn't said Mike at all. It was just a scream. That went on for 7 months, until the case suddenly took a shocking turn. On June 1st, 1999, the lead detective got a call from the Baltimore County Police Department. An officer there explained that one of their inmates had just confessed to killing Sarah. The inmate was a 19-year-old named Ardell Tickles, who'd been arrested 3 months earlier for an armed robbery at a McDonald's. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, he told his cellmate that he'd murdered a woman in her own home. The cellmate quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, wore a wire, and started asking Ardell for details about the killing. Ardell explained how he'd broken into the house through a window and attacked the victim with a machete. He described her injuries with such precision that detectives had no doubt he was talking about Sarah. He even gave the exact date it happened, the night she was killed. Ardell bragged about how his victim died while he kept striking her, saying he wanted her to suffer as much as possible. Finally, when his cellmate asked why he'd done it, Ardell gave an answer that floored detectives. He said a former coworker had paid him $5,000 to kill her. Investigators were convinced he wasn't lying about being the killer. His confession included details that had never been released to the public. The lead detective headed straight to the jail to confront him. He told Ardell he'd be facing first-degree murder charges and made it clear that they already had his confession on tape, so he'd better start talking. Ardell didn't deny a thing. He admitted he had killed the woman without even knowing her name. He added that he didn't feel any remorse because, according to him, Sarah was a bad person. He claimed the former coworker who hired him for the job told him that Sarah once pushed a pregnant black woman down a flight of stairs and spit in her face. Ardell also said that instead of the promised $5,000, he only got $3,000, but the money didn't matter to him as much as punishing her for what she'd supposedly done. At that point, the detectives laid out 3 photos: Lorenzo, his brother, and his father, and asked Ardell which one of them had hired him. To his surprise, Ardell didn't recognize any of them. He explained that the person who hired him wasn't a man at all, but a woman, though he didn't know her name. That raised even more questions. How could he have worked with this woman and not even know who she was? And what kind of woman would want Sarah dead? One thing was clear though. This woman knew Sarah very well. According to Ardell, just days before the murder, she drove Ardell to Sarah's house and told him the best time to strike would be Saturday because Sarah would be home alone. She even explained how her alarm system was set up and warned him not to tamper with it so the neighbors wouldn't hear a thing. With this new lead in hand, detectives shifted their focus to finding the woman behind it all. Ardell had worked at a nursing home laundry in Baltimore, so police pulled the employee roster, hoping he'd recognize someone. But what they stumbled across was far more shocking. One name on that list instantly told them who the mysterious woman was. Her name was Amelia, and she was Lorenzo's mother. Detectives went back to the jail and showed Ardell a photo of Amelia. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was the one who had hired him. What really stunned him, though, was learning that Amelia wasn't just some stranger. She was Sarah's mother-in-law. He explained that Amelia often brought the little boy to work, and he'd assumed she was just the child's babysitter. When he realized that the boy was actually Sarah's son, Ardell was floored. He said the only reason he agreed to the murder was because he believed Sarah was racist, and he thought he was punishing her for that. But now he understood he'd been manipulated from the very start. Of course, there was no undoing what he had already done, and for detectives, the real challenge was still ahead. Ardell's confession alone wasn't enough to put Amelia away. They needed hard evidence to prove she'd orchestrated the murder. Talking to staff at the nursing home, detectives found a woman willing to cooperate in exchange for full immunity. She told them that on the day of the murder, Ardell had asked her to help him become a killer by renting a car for him, since he was too young to do it himself. She thought he was joking and went along with it. But just a few hours after she handed over the rental, Ardell brought it back, and his boots were covered in blood. He told her he had just gotten rid of the devil and asked for her help. They drove out to a vacant lot where they burned his bloody boots. On their way back to the car, 2 officers stopped them. The cops searched the vehicle and even found a knife under the seat with blood on the handle. But instead of arresting both of them, they simply took the knife and left. Digging deeper, detectives also discovered that just weeks before the murder, Sarah's mother-in-law had withdrawn $2,500 in cash. Soon after, Ardell deposited nearly the exact same amount into his own bank account, a connection that was hard to ignore. Lab experts compared Ardell's DNA with the sample found on the machete, and it was a perfect match. That was enough to charge him with murder, and right after that, detectives went after Amelia. She was brought into the station, where she called Lorenzo. She told him she was probably going to prison, and he didn't even ask what for. His reaction was strangely calm. After that, Amelia refused to answer any more questions and demanded a lawyer. Knowing that the evidence they had might not be enough to secure a conviction, the lead detective decided to bluff. He told her that if they uncovered proof Lorenzo knew about the murder, their family would never see the child again. Amelia sat in that room for a few hours before finally giving in. She waived her right to an attorney and told detectives she was ready to confess. She admitted that she had never really liked Sarah and thought she was ungrateful. Things only got worse after the baby was born. Amelia believed Sarah wasn't raising him properly, but Sarah never listened to her. Over the next few months, the tension kept building, and their arguments became more and more frequent. When Sarah finally filed for divorce, Amelia panicked, afraid she'd never see her grandson again. And that's when she snapped. She wanted revenge, but insisted she never meant for Sarah to be killed. According to Amelia, she had casually mentioned her frustrations to Ardell at work, and he told her she needed to get back at Sarah for the disrespect. He even offered to help, promising to take care of it. Amelia claimed that Ardell told her he only planned to throw rocks at Sarah's house to scare her. Detectives doubted that version of events, especially since Amelia had paid him a large amount of money, far too much for something as petty as tossing a few stones. In the end, Amelia said no one else in her family, including Lorenzo, knew anything about her involvement. Investigators never found any evidence to prove otherwise, so prosecutors went ahead and sent the case to court. The first to stand trial was Ardell. He claimed Amelia had manipulated him, tricking him into killing an innocent woman. He even said he'd spent the past months praying for Sarah and her family. But the jury wasn't moved, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia's trial began in January 2000, and not a single member of her family showed up. Her lawyer tried to argue there wasn't enough to directly tie her to the murder, but the evidence was stacked against her. In the end, she too was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. In 2009, she filed an appeal, claiming Sarah didn't deserve to die and that she had long since forgiven her. This questionable statement had no effect, and the original sentence was upheld. As for Sarah's son, he continued living with his father. Lorenzo eventually remarried and had 3 more children. On February 8, 2023, he passed away at the age of 57. Amelia, now 89 years old, is still serving her life sentence. Ardell eventually became eligible for parole, but when he applied in 2024, his request was denied. He remains behind bars to this day.
Angie Dodge was born on December 21, 1977, in Washington State. She was the youngest in the family and the only girl, with 3 older brothers. Her dad was in the military, so the family moved around a lot. For Angie, that meant constantly switching schools and leaving friends behind, which wasn't easy. Still, she did great in school and had a close bond with her brothers. The whole family loved the outdoors and often went camping together, something Angie grew to love early on. Her favorite time of year was Christmas. It came just a few days after her birthday, so the whole family would usually come together and they'd celebrate both at once. When Angie's dad left the military, the family was finally able to settle down. They moved to Idaho and made a home in a small town called Idaho Falls. Angie enrolled at the local high school and quickly made friends. She was doing well in class too, and often helped other students improve their grades. After graduating in 1995, she got a job at a local bookstore. Not long after that, she moved into her very first apartment. Angie had plans to go to the University of Idaho, but she wanted to save up a bit of money first. So she spent some time working, bought herself a car she'd been dreaming about for years, and enjoyed more time with her family and friends. On June 12, 1996, 18-year-old Angie went to visit her parents. She and her mom had been in a fight recently, but that day they made up and had a really nice time together before Angie headed back home. The next morning, she was scheduled to work a shift at the bookstore, but she never showed up. Her parents tried calling her, but got no answer. That was unlike Angie, who had never missed work before. Eventually, 2 of her coworkers decided to swing by her apartment to make sure everything was okay. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. After waiting a few minutes, they decided to try the handle, and to their surprise, the door was unlocked. So they stepped inside and started looking around. At first, it seemed like no one was home, but when they peeked into the bedroom, they were met with a horrifying scene. Angie was lying on the floor next to her bed, and there was blood everywhere. The coworkers ran outside and immediately called the police. Officers arrived and began processing the scene, and it was clear from the start they were dealing with a brutal murder. Angie's underwear had been pulled down, her tank top was torn, and there were multiple wounds on her body that looked like stab marks. All signs pointed to a sexual assault, and the medical examiner later confirmed it. They also recovered biological material from the attacker, along with bits of skin found under Angie's fingernails, suggesting she fought back. On top of that, crime scene techs found a single male hair at the scene. Everything was sent to the lab for testing, and forensic experts were able to build a DNA profile of an unknown man. But at the time, the FBI didn't yet have a national DNA database, so police had no choice but to manually compare the sample against individual suspects, one by one. Detectives spoke with everyone who knew Angie and asked them to submit their DNA samples. She had a pretty big group of friends who often hung out by the local river, one of the few places to relax in their small town. In addition to friends, police also questioned Angie's coworkers and local men with prior offenses. Altogether, they collected over 100 DNA samples, but none of them matched the killer. And despite months of work, they couldn't find a single viable suspect. That was partly because, aside from the DNA, there wasn't much else to go on. Angie had no enemies, got along with just about everyone, and the exact circumstances of her death were still unclear. Medical examiners could only narrow down the time of death to somewhere between late night and early morning. Police also had no idea how the killer got inside. Since there were no signs of forced entry and the door had been unlocked, they came up with two theories. Either Angie left it open for some reason, or she knew this person and let them in herself. They also started to suspect there might have been more than one attacker. Based on the nature of Angie's wounds, investigators believed someone might have held her down while another delivered the fatal blows. Still, all this remained nothing more than guesswork, because police had no real suspects. The investigation dragged on for months, and Angie's family grew increasingly frustrated that the killer was still out there. Over time, they began to question whether detectives were doing enough to solve the case and voiced their concerns publicly. Losing faith in the investigation, Angie's mom took matters into her own hands. She printed thousands of flyers with details about the case and handed them out all over town. The family also offered a $5,000 reward for any information that could help identify the killer. There was no breakthrough, but the pressure from Angie's family, along with growing concern from the community, pushed police to reopen the investigation and start from scratch. Since there were still no new leads, detectives began asking themselves who was most likely to have committed the crime. Out of everyone in Angie's circle, their focus shifted to her close group of friends, people she spent the most time with. They investigated all of them one more time, but again came up empty. But not long after, the investigation took a surprising turn. In January of 1997, police got a call from authorities in Nevada. They had just arrested a man named Benjamin for sexually assaulting a woman at knife point. That immediately raised red flags for detectives, because Benjamin used to hang out with the same group of friends as Angie. He'd moved out of state not long after the murder, and the way he attacked his victim was disturbingly similar to what had happened to Angie. Investigators traveled to Nevada to speak with him, but Benjamin denied having anything to do with Angie's murder. In fact, during the interview, he made a strange claim. He said he didn't even know Angie had been raped. That raised a huge red flag. Benjamin had been her friend, and the fact that she was sexually assaulted was public knowledge. It had been reported in the papers and on the local news, so everyone in their town knew it. Still, Benjamin stuck to his story and agreed to provide a DNA sample. When forensic experts compared it to the killer's profile, it wasn't a match. But detectives weren't ready to cross Benjamin off the list. From the very beginning, they'd considered the possibility that more than one person was involved. Maybe Benjamin hadn't assaulted Angie, but what if he helped with the murder? They decided to focus on the same group of friends Angie and Benjamin had been a part of, specifically on one guy Benjamin had mentioned during questioning. His name was Christopher, and according to Benjamin, the two of them had been pretty close. Detectives brought Christopher in for an interview. He denied any involvement in the murder and said he didn't believe Benjamin was guilty either. In fact, he claimed he had no idea who could have done something like this to Angie. But the police weren't convinced. A few days later, they called Christopher back in for a second round of questioning. They kept pressing him about Benjamin, and eventually, Christopher admitted that maybe Benjamin could have had something to do with it. For detectives, this was the break they'd been waiting for. Not just because they finally had something to use against Benjamin, but because Christopher had just changed his story. Still, he kept insisting he had nothing to do with the murder, so the police had no choice but to let him go for now. They scheduled a follow-up interview a few days later, but Christopher never showed up. When officers went to his house, his mother came to the door. She told them her son would get in touch when he felt ready, and that from now on, he'd only speak to them with a lawyer present. To the detectives, it felt like Christopher was dodging them, and maybe even thinking about skipping town. So, they made the decision to arrest him, based on the fact that he'd changed his original statement. Once they tracked him down and brought him back in, they began another round of questioning. This time, they ran him through a series of polygraph tests, and the results were all over the place. Nothing came out as clearly truthful, which only deepened their suspicions. Over the course of several sessions, detectives questioned Christopher for more than 60 hours, and eventually, he started to crack. At first, he denied having anything to do with the murder, but now, his story changed. He admitted that he had been in Angie's apartment that night. Then, he claimed he wasn't alone. According to Christopher, Benjamin was there too, and while Benjamin stabbed Angie, Christopher said he held her down. He also mentioned a third person, 18-year-old Jeremy, another friend from their group. Police arrested Jeremy, but he swore he was innocent, and DNA testing backed him up. In fact, every bit of biological evidence from the crime scene ruled out all three of the guys Christopher had just named, including Christopher himself. That left investigators with a big problem. The confession didn't match the physical evidence. So, they dropped the charges against Benjamin and Jeremy and focused solely on Christopher. Over the next couple of years, prosecutors built their case, and in 1998, Christopher finally went on trial. By then, police had found a witness who claimed she overheard Christopher talking to a friend about the murder. Based on what he said, it sounded like he'd been directly involved. In court, the jury also watched clips from his interrogation, where he described the crime in graphic detail. During his closing statement, Christopher said he wasn't the monster everyone thought he was, and begged the judge for mercy. In the end, the jury found him guilty of being an accessory to Angie's murder, and he was sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. So, Christopher went off to serve his sentence, but Angie's family was still left with unanswered questions. If none of the three suspects matched the DNA from the crime scene, then who had assaulted their daughter? And why did the other two walk free? After the trial, Angie's mother kept pressing police for answers, but she never got anything solid. Investigators didn't seem interested in finishing what they'd started, and with each passing year, her family began to lose hope of ever learning the full truth. For nearly 8 years, Angie's mom showed up at the police station almost every single day, begging them to keep the case open. But eventually, she realized they weren't going to do anything. That's when she made a decision, not to wait on the police, but to launch her own investigation. She started keeping tabs on the two suspects who were still free, hoping to find anything that might point to the truth. She even tracked down local drug dealers, asking if they'd heard anything about Angie's case. One time, she wandered into such a dangerous part of town that someone nearly shot her. This went on until 2009, when she came across an organization that helped people who had been wrongfully convicted. To her surprise, one of the people who had reached out to them was Christopher. She decided to contact the organization herself, something that had never happened before in the state. A victim's family member asking for help from a group trying to free the accused. That's when she learned that Christopher had been claiming his innocence for years. According to him, the police had pressured and manipulated him into confessing. Angie's mom, who'd spent over a decade believing he was guilty, decided to take a closer look. She requested the full recordings of Christopher's interrogations and watched all 60 hours of footage. The video and audio were grainy and hard to make out, but she pushed through, trying to catch every word. And when she finished, she was shocked and furious. Based on the tapes, she realized something devastating. Christopher had nothing to do with her daughter's murder. For most of the interrogation, he denied everything. But the police kept pushing, relentlessly, until he started repeating what they wanted to hear. Based on the footage, he had no idea what they were even asking. The detectives were feeding him details, one after another. He didn't know Angie's address, so they told him. He said the murder happened in the living room. They corrected him, said it was the bedroom, and he just went along with it. Angie's mother was stunned. She now believed the detectives had pushed this young man to the brink until he would have confessed to anything. So she reached out to his new lawyer, who had been working to get the case reopened, and together they started searching for the truth. Over the next few years, they teamed up with another organization that helped innocent people get their convictions overturned, and they began building a case for appeal. Along the way, Christopher's lawyer tracked down the so-called witness who had testified that she overheard him confess to the murder. But when she spoke to the defense, she admitted that police had pressured her to lie. On top of that, the full interrogation footage clearly showed just how far the detectives had gone, well past the line of what was legal or ethical. Eventually, they filed an appeal, and in 2017, 19 years after Christopher was convicted, a judge officially dropped the charges related to the sexual assault, citing the fact that his DNA didn't match the sample found at the scene. That decision gave him the right to walk free, though the murder conviction still technically remained on his record. When the judge read out the ruling and Christopher was declared a free man, Angie's mother stood up, wrapped her arms around him, and walked out of the courtroom by his side, holding his hand. But this wasn't the end, just the beginning. Since the law still labeled Christopher a murderer, both he and Angie's mother were determined to clear his name completely. By that point, nearly all of the original investigators had retired, and the department had a new lead detective, one who was also committed to finally uncovering the truth. Working alongside Christopher and Angie's mother, the new lead detective kept digging into the case, with all hopes now resting on DNA. By this time, forensic technology had come a long way, and they still had several samples from the crime scene in storage. But their first renewed attempt didn't lead anywhere. Experts analyzed the evidence and ran the profiles through national databases, but nothing came up. Then, in 2018, they turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in genetic genealogy. This method uses publicly shared DNA data from genealogy websites, where millions of people upload their genetic profiles to learn about their ancestry or find relatives. With enough matches, experts can start tracing a suspect's family tree, even from distant relatives, and eventually narrow it down to the person they're looking for. Eventually, they landed on an elderly couple who had 6 male descendants, all of whom had lived in Idaho around the time of Angie's murder. Police tracked each one down and tested their DNA, but none of them were a match. Still, the detectives weren't ready to give up. They kept digging deeper into the family tree, and eventually landed on one man who seemed like a promising lead. Investigators began looking into his background, and word quickly spread that he was a suspect in a decades-old murder. His life was turned upside down, but when his DNA was tested, the results proved he wasn't the killer. 3 months later, detectives made another discovery. There was one more man from that same family who hadn't been considered yet, a man named Brian Drips. He was a former soldier and the father of 3 kids. The reason he'd been missed was pretty simple. He was adopted as a child and had grown up under a different last name. This time, police moved carefully. They didn't want to repeat the mistake of falsely implicating someone and ruining their life. So, they put Drips under surveillance, waited until he tossed a cigarette butt out his car window, then collected it and sent it to the lab. When the results came back, detectives finally had a match. After more than 2 decades, they'd found their man. As the investigation moved forward, detectives learned that at the time of Angie's murder, Brian Dripps had actually lived right across the street from her. Police had even spoken to him during the original investigation, but for some reason, he was never treated as a suspect. They also found out that his ex-wife had left him because of his extensive drug use. Now, armed with a DNA match, police arrested Brian and brought him in for questioning. For nearly 5 hours, he denied any involvement. But once detectives revealed the DNA evidence, everything changed. Brian went silent, and a few minutes later, he asked to step outside for a smoke. When he came back, he sat quietly for a moment, and then said, "I did it." According to Brian, he'd been drunk and high the night Angie was killed. He claimed his memory of that night was hazy, but he did recall sexually assaulting her. The rest, he said, was a blur. After his confession, Brian Dripps was officially charged with Angie's murder. And after more than 2 decades, Christopher was finally cleared once and for all. The trial of Brian Dripps didn't begin until February 2021, several years after his arrest. In court, he didn't take back his confession. He repeated everything he told the detectives. As part of his defense, Brian claimed he hadn't meant to kill Angie. He said he only intended to sexually assault her. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. And just like that, Angie's case was finally solved. But this story didn't end with the conviction of the real killer. After his release, Christopher struggled to return to anything resembling a normal life. He spoke openly about how prison had broken him, and how, after spending so many years behind bars, he had no idea what to do with his freedom. Adjusting to life on the outside wasn't easy, but eventually he found a job, made new friends, and even got married. Christopher also pushed for a law that would guarantee compensation for the wrongfully convicted. Thanks to his efforts, the state passed it, and he received around $1 million. He also filed lawsuits against the detectives who had coerced his false confession, and the court awarded him an additional $11.4 million in damages. It seemed like his life was finally starting to turn around. But in 2023, everything changed. Earlier that year, he and his wife filed for divorce, and not long after, she died in a car crash. 2 months later, Christopher got into an argument with a professional wrestler at a hotel party. The man attacked him, and during the fight, Christopher hit his head on the table. He died a few hours later in the hospital. Police arrested the wrestler and discovered that he had a long history of violent behavior. He'd been involved in several serious altercations before. This time, he was charged with homicide, and now he could be facing a long prison sentence of his own. Even though Angie's case was finally solved, the road to justice came at a devastating cost. Police had destroyed the life of an innocent man, and just 6 years after he was released from prison, Christopher was dead. It's also important to remember that this case might have remained unsolved if it weren't for Angie's mother. She spent over 20 years fighting for the truth, refusing to give up, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way.
Sophie Colombe was born in 1993 in a small French village called Saint-Julien-Mont-Denis. It was a quiet, picturesque place in the Alps, where Sophie grew up with her parents and 2 older brothers. From an early age, she had a passion for music and even played in her village's local ensemble. She also dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing school, Sophie moved to Denmark to study international business, and later she went to Germany for an internship. Then, in 2013, she was accepted into a master's program at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. She moved there with her boyfriend, and the 2 of them rented an apartment near the university. But a year later, his visa expired, and he returned to France. Sophie still had 1 more year left to finish, and at first, she thought about going back with him. In the end, though, she decided to stay and complete her degree. On top of her studies, Sophie worked several jobs just to make ends meet, waiting tables, doing cleaning work, and even giving private French lessons. But it still wasn't enough to afford her own place. So she moved in with some university friends who were sharing an apartment. On the morning of March 27, 2014, 21-year-old Sophie set out for the university as usual. That day, her classes were scheduled to run late into the evening. Throughout the day, she kept in touch with her boyfriend, messaging back and forth, until, sometime that evening, she suddenly stopped replying. By the next morning, there was still no word from her, and he began to panic. After trying and failing to reach her by phone, he went online to check the Brisbane Police Department's social media page, hoping for any sign of her. That's when he stumbled on a brand new post. Police had uploaded photos of several pieces of women's jewelry, asking the public for help identifying who they belonged to. The moment he saw those pictures, his heart sank. He knew those items immediately. They were Sophie's. He called the Brisbane police right away and told them what he'd seen, and that's when they finally told him what had happened. Early that morning, police were contacted by a homeless man who lived in a park not far from Sophie's apartment. He told them that while walking through the park, he noticed someone lying on a bench, covered with old newspapers as if trying to keep warm. At first, he thought it was just another person sleeping rough for the night, but when he got closer, he saw it was a young woman. He tried to wake her, shook her shoulder, called out to her, but there was no response. That's when he noticed blood matted in her hair. He reached out to check for a pulse and felt nothing. Realizing she was dead, he immediately went to the police. Officers confirmed that the young woman had died and sent her body to medical examiners. The autopsy revealed a devastating head injury, the fatal blow with a heavy object. They also found numerous abrasions and confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted. Investigators concluded she'd been attacked just a few yards from that bench and then dragged over and left there. Whoever did it had placed her on the bench and covered her with newspapers, likely hoping her body would go unnoticed. And in that park, it made sense. The area was a known hangout for the homeless, and seeing someone asleep on a bench was nothing unusual. If that's what the killer was counting on, it worked. According to medical experts, the attack happened the previous evening, but Sophie didn't die right away. She lived for several more hours. She remained on that bench until late into the night, slowly succumbing to her injuries. If someone had called for help, doctors might have been able to save her. But no one called. Most people, it seems, simply thought she was another homeless person asleep in the dark. Once police sent Sophie's boyfriend a photo of the victim, and he confirmed it was her, detectives threw everything they had into the investigation. One of their first priorities was to find her clothes and belongings, because when her body was discovered, she was wearing nothing but her jewelry. But after combing through the park and checking every nearby trash bin, they didn't find a single trace. Investigators then began piecing together Sophie's final day, step by step, to try and retrace her movements. Footage from a CCTV camera near her apartment showed her leaving that morning and boarding a bus to the university. She spent almost the entire day on campus, and at about 8:30 that evening, she headed home. By then, it had started raining. A classmate offered to give her a lift, but Sophie turned him down, saying she'd just take the bus. Cameras near the bus stops captured her getting on and later getting off at her usual stop. From there, she would have needed to walk across a bridge over the river to get home. But to reach that bridge, she first had to cut through the very same park where her body was later found. After that point, there was no more footage, nothing to show what happened next. Detectives turned to the public, hoping someone might have seen something that rainy night, but almost no one had been out in that weather. And that gave the killer the perfect chance to attack her in the middle of that tiny park without being seen. Police also asked the public to keep an eye out for any of Sophie's missing belongings. She'd been carrying a phone, a tablet, an umbrella, and her handbag. When none of those items turned up in the park, they brought in divers to search the river. Before long, the divers found an umbrella about a mile downstream. But even then, investigators couldn't say for sure if it belonged to Sophie. News of Sophie's murder immediately drew massive attention across the city, and for more than one reason. First, police openly admitted they couldn't rule out the possibility that the killer might strike again. And second, Sophie was the fourth international student murdered in Brisbane in just a few months. Even though those other cases were unrelated and the suspects in them had already been caught, people were starting to see a chilling pattern, and the sense of unease kept growing. Meanwhile, detectives kept digging through surveillance footage near the park, combing through hours upon hours of video. Then, finally, they spotted someone. A man walking past the park both before and after the estimated time of Sophie's death. That time window had been narrowed down almost to the minute, based on Sophie's movements captured by other cameras. What really made him stand out wasn't just how often he appeared near the park. It was the fact that he never came forward, despite repeated public appeals asking anyone who'd been in the area that night to contact police. Even with the heavy rain, dozens of people reached out saying they'd passed through or nearby at some point, but this man's name never came up. Investigators tried to follow his trail. Cameras showed him entering a subway station near the park and riding a few stops. After that, though, the trail went cold. They suspected he might have been heading toward the train station near the airport, possibly to catch a train out of the city. Detectives went back to the park to speak with people who'd spent most of their time there, hoping someone might recognize the man from the footage. Before long, they found a witness who said he'd actually been drinking with that man on the night of the murder. According to him, the man's name was Ben, and he'd been staying at a homeless hostel a few miles from the park, on the other side of the river. That hostel already had a bad reputation. Many of the residents were recently released prisoners with nowhere else to go. Police headed over there and showed staff a photo of the man from the surveillance footage. They recognized him immediately and confirmed that he was indeed one of their residents, 25-year-old Benjamin Millward. The staff also mentioned something unsettling. They hadn't seen Benjamin since the night Sophie was killed. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind almost all of his belongings, as if he'd left in a hurry. All of this gave police every reason to dig deeper, and finding Benjamin quickly became their top priority. 8 days after the murder, they went public with his name and photo, asking anyone with information on his whereabouts to come forward. As detectives looked into his background, they discovered that Benjamin had quite a record. Back in 2012, he'd been released from prison, where he was serving time for assault. But soon after, he was arrested again for violating parole and only gained full freedom in 2013. On top of that, his record included theft, drug charges, and a string of lesser offenses. Investigators also learned something else while speaking with the other hostel residents. One of them said that just hours before Sophie's murder, Benjamin had been heavily drunk and under the influence of drugs. Benjamin even admitted to him that he hadn't used in a long time, and the last time he did, things went badly. Another resident reported seeing Benjamin in the park around 5 p.m., taking another dose. After that, they went their separate ways because the resident wanted to get back to the hostel before it locked up at 9 p.m. Benjamin, however, never returned that night. That same resident later recalled spotting him outside the building around 11 p.m. after Sophie's murder, and said Benjamin looked deeply unsettled, nervous, and was acting strangely. While police waited for leads on his whereabouts, Benjamin's relatives and acquaintances began reaching out. Every single one of them insisted they didn't believe he could be involved in a murder. His family said they hadn't heard from him since the day Sophie was killed, and they even went on TV pleading with him to come forward and clear his name. But Benjamin stayed silent, and detectives grew more and more convinced that he'd already left the city. They circulated his photo and details to other towns and states, hoping someone would spot him. Before long, they got a promising lead. Staff at a small hotel in a town called Ballina, located in another state, reported that a man matching Benjamin's description had stayed with them for a few days, but he was already gone. Police immediately alerted officers in nearby towns, warning them that Benjamin might be moving through the area. And soon enough, 2 officers in a coastal city called Coffs Harbour, just a few dozen miles from that hotel, noticed a man on the street in the middle of the night who looked just like him. They approached and asked, "Are you Benjamin?" And the man calmly replied, Yeah, you got me. Is this because of the internet?" He was immediately arrested and extradited back to Brisbane. Detectives took his DNA, and it matched the skin particles found under Sophie's fingernails, finally and undeniably tying him to her murder. After Benjamin was placed in custody to await trial, his lawyer spoke to the media. He said his client was feeling overwhelmed by all the pressure surrounding the case, but otherwise, he was doing fine. Once in court, Benjamin didn't try to deny what he'd done. During the proceedings, he admitted to the murder in front of the judge and even asked Sophie's family for forgiveness. But then he revealed a detail that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. According to him, after attacking and assaulting Sophie, he told her he was going to get help. Yet instead, he simply walked away, leaving her to die alone on that park bench in the pouring rain. Before fleeing the city, he also threw all of her belongings into the river. As for his motive, Benjamin claimed that he hadn't been in control of himself, blaming everything on the drugs he'd taken. He said he barely remembered the attack at all, recalling only fragments of what he'd done to her. However, experts cast serious doubt on Benjamin's claims. They explained that the substances he'd taken on the day of the murder typically don't drive someone to commit a crime this violent, and certainly not something so calculated. His condition, they said, couldn't be used as an excuse. On top of that, the drugs wouldn't normally cause such severe memory loss, yet Benjamin insisted he could barely remember anything. And, as investigators pointed out, he'd been clear-headed enough to buy train tickets and leave the city without drawing attention to himself. In the end, the court sentenced Benjamin to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. He also received an additional 15 years for the sexual assault, to be served at the same time. So, given his age, Benjamin could still walk free before he turns 50. It's also worth noting that Benjamin's mother spoke to reporters after the trial. She praised her son for admitting what he'd done and said she blamed the drugs for everything that happened, insisting that he would never have done something like this sober. In the end, the case was solved relatively quickly, but the shockwaves it sent through Brisbane lasted much longer. After Sophie's death, locals demanded that authorities step up security in that park and called out the hostel for accepting anyone at all, including recently released violent offenders and murderers. Many women came forward with their own stories of being harassed in that same park, saying they'd never once seen police in that area. Memorials were held all over the city. More than 2,000 people joined a candlelight march, following the route Sophie should have taken home that night. Her funeral took place in her hometown in France, and it drew nearly 1,200 people out of a village of just 1,500. It became the largest funeral the village had seen in decades, since the death of a beloved mayor. So many came to pay their respects that mourners ended up filling 8 entire journals with condolences. Leslie Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, in Rhode Island. She was one of 8 children, and the family moved often because her father served in the Army. When she was 12, they moved to Pensacola in Florida, where Leslie finished school. After that, she enrolled at the University of Florida to study journalism, and there she met a young man named Carl. In 1974, when Leslie was 22, they got married, and 3 years later they had a daughter, Lauren. Sometime later, the family moved to a town called Chevy Chase, a suburb of Washington, D.C., and Leslie took a job at an advertising agency. In the years that followed, she lived a calm, steady life. On May 2, 2001, when Leslie was 48, she was supposed to be at work by 10 a.m., but she never showed up. About half an hour later, her boss started to worry. Leslie had never missed work without calling in. He pulled her daughter's number from the emergency contacts and gave her a call. But at the time, she was at university and no longer living at home, so she had no idea where her mom could be. Next, her boss got in touch with Leslie's husband, but he didn't know anything either. He said he had left the house around 7:30 that morning, and at the time, Leslie was still getting ready for work. Usually, she left shortly after him, walked to the bus stop, and took the bus into Washington. The commute took about an hour, so by then, she should have been at the office. Her husband tried calling their home phone, but no one picked up. He started to seriously worry something might have happened to her, so he decided to head back to the house. Leslie's boss did the same, afraid she might be in danger. They both arrived around 11:30 and went inside. Right away, they noticed the front door was unlocked, but the house was quiet. Then, they saw red stains along the hallway walls that looked like blood, with several bloody footprints on the floor. Leslie's boss immediately called the police while her husband searched through the house. He found their dog shut inside the basement, but Leslie herself was nowhere to be seen. The 911 operator told them to step outside and wait for officers so they wouldn't disturb any potential evidence, and the men left the house together with the dog. Police arrived within minutes and began searching the house. When they went upstairs, they found Leslie's body in the bathroom, lying face down inside the shower stall. From the way she was positioned, detectives believe she had been killed elsewhere in the house, and the killer had dragged her into the shower afterward. It looked like he may have planned to rinse her off and wash away any traces of DNA. Crime scene techs also found evidence that the killer had tried to clean up blood from the floor and hallway door. More blood was discovered in the kitchen sink, the downstairs bathroom, and even on the trash can. All of this showed that the killer had stayed inside the house for some time after the murder, making an effort to cover his tracks. But with so much blood everywhere, it was a hopeless task. One detail stood out in particular. The killer had used cleaning products, but none of those chemicals were found in the house. That suggested he had brought them with him, planning the cleanup in advance. But even with all that evidence, the local police department decided they didn't have enough to officially classify the case as a homicide. Instead, they chose to wait for the coroner's report, leaving open the possibility that Leslie's death might have been some kind of accident. One theory was that she could have slipped while cleaning the bathroom, though that explanation didn't really line up with the facts. Because of this, the house wasn't processed the way a murder scene should have been. For example, investigators never swabbed the blood on the doorframe. They just left it there. Meanwhile, the word of Leslie's death spread quickly through the community, and people were stunned. This was a town known for having one of the lowest crime rates in the entire country, where murders almost never happened. What made things even worse was the silence from the police. Nobody understood what had really happened inside that house, and the uncertainty fueled even more fear. 2 days later, the medical examiner finished the autopsy, and the results left no doubt. This was a murder. Leslie had 7 wounds on her head, caused by being slammed against a sharp, solid surface. Later, investigators determined that those injuries matched the sharp corners of the baseboard in the hallway. It looked like the attacker had knocked her down and repeatedly bashed her head against the floor. On top of that, her body showed multiple abrasions consistent with a violent struggle, and there were also clear signs of strangulation. This confirmed the detectives' original theory. Leslie had been attacked and killed in the hallway, and afterward the killer dragged her body upstairs to the bathroom, hoping to wash away the evidence. Forensics collected every possible blood sample from the house and sent them off to the lab. Meanwhile, now that detectives finally had proof they were dealing with a homicide, the real investigation began. While they waited on the DNA results, detectives started talking to Leslie's family and friends. Nobody could think of a single person who would want to hurt her. She didn't have enemies, and she never got into conflicts. Naturally, investigators first looked at Leslie's husband, Carl. He told them he'd left for work around 7:30 that morning, and a neighbor backed him up, saying they saw him leaving the house and even waving to someone at the window. His coworkers also confirmed that he showed up on time and stayed there until he got the call from Leslie's boss. That made it unlikely he could have committed the murder, unless he had somehow done it before heading to work. But there were no scratches or bruises on him, something almost impossible to avoid, given the defensive injuries Leslie had. On top of that, everyone who knew the couple swore their marriage was solid and happy. A short time later, the lab results came back. Forensics had identified foreign DNA mixed with Leslie's blood in 3 different spots throughout the house. They also found bits of skin under her fingernails, pointing to the same unknown individual. The problem was, the DNA didn't match anyone in the database. Testing against Carl's DNA also came back negative. Detectives went on to collect samples from several other men who knew Leslie, but none of those were a match either. There were no other solid leads at the crime scene, and detectives quickly hit a wall. They tried piecing together a timeline and realized the killer had just a little over 2 hours to break into the house, carry out the murder, attempt a cleanup, and then get away. Since the blood hadn't been fully washed off, investigators even considered the possibility that the killer might still have been inside when Carl and Leslie's boss showed up. Maybe he spotted them through a window and slipped out the back door before they came in. With no real evidence or motive to go on, police started looking into whether Leslie's case could be tied to a string of burglaries in the area. But that theory went nowhere. A short time later, the county pulled together a special task force to review unsolved murders across nearby towns. There were 6 in total, and investigators thought they might be connected. In the end, though, that link was ruled out. For months after, the case went nowhere. Detectives kept running down different suspects, but every lead fizzled out. One of the biggest problems was motive. The killer hadn't stolen anything valuable from the house, and there was no sign of personal grudges. Leslie simply didn't have enemies. To detectives, it all looked like a completely random killing, a crime with no real sense behind it. From that point on, the case went cold for years, and detectives made no progress toward an arrest. Some people still believed the killer had to be Carl, that somehow he'd managed to outsmart investigators and walk away free. But Leslie's daughter never once believed her father was guilty. She stood by him through it all. That continued until 2017, when Carl passed away of natural causes. Later, his daughter said he died of a broken heart, never knowing who had taken his wife from him. In 2022, 21 years after Leslie's murder, the local police department put together a special cold case team. They reopened her case, but the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in the FBI's genetic database. So detectives went back over everything. They re-interviewed everyone connected to the investigation, and once again reached out to the public, hoping that after all these years, someone might finally come forward with new information. But once again, nothing. That's when investigators decided to try a new approach. They sent the existing DNA samples to a company called Othram, which specialized in genetic genealogy. The way it works is pretty simple and complicated at the same time. Investigators take an unknown DNA sample and run it through public genealogy databases where people upload their own results. Almost every time, at least one relative pops up, even if it's a distant one. From there, experts build out family trees and trace them back to the most likely suspect, narrowing it down by things like age, location, and other details. The experts at Othram got to work, and before long, they managed to identify a relative of the killer, a man living in Romania. The connection turned out to be pretty distant, so it took another 2 years of digging through family trees before they finally got close to a real suspect. By 2024, they had zeroed in on a family that had been living in Leslie's town at the time of the murder. Their last name was Gligor, and the moment detectives heard it, they realized it wasn't unfamiliar. Looking back through the old case files, they found a tip that had come in nearly a year after the murder, pointing directly at a man named Eugene Gligor, a former neighbor. But that wasn't all. Detectives also discovered that Eugene had once dated the victim's daughter, Lauren. The two had been together for about 5 years. They first met in high school when they were both 15. Eugene lived just a 10-minute walk from Lauren's house, and he spent a lot of time there. Leslie thought he was a great guy, but Lauren's father never trusted him. He always said there was something off about Eugene, though he could never quite explain what it was. When they turned 20 and Lauren left for college, the relationship started to fizzle out, and eventually they broke up. It was a clean break. Eugene didn't seem bitter or angry, and from that point on, Lauren barely stayed in touch with him. Over the years, though, Eugene racked up a string of arrests for illegal weapons possession, theft, and drunk driving. What made it strange was that he came from a well-off family and didn't need to steal cheap things from other people's homes. Still, none of those charges were serious enough to require him to submit a DNA sample, which explained why his profile was never in the FBI database. There was also another troubling incident that dated back to when Eugene and Lauren were 16. A woman had been attacked by a teenager, and she gave police a description that closely matched Eugene. He denied it, and none of his friends could imagine him doing something like that. In fact, Lauren and one of her friends even went down to the police station themselves to vouch for him, insisting he was completely harmless. At the time of Leslie's murder, Eugene was just 21. Detectives also uncovered another interesting detail. Only 2 months after the killing, he and his mother moved to Washington, D.C. From then on, he stayed off the radar, never getting into trouble again. What stood out was that even though a neighbor had tipped police off about him back in 2002, detectives never actually spoke to him about Leslie's case. But now, with his name flagged by the genealogical search, Eugene instantly became their prime suspect. By 2024, he was still living in D.C. and working for a company that sold surveillance equipment. Investigators started thinking about how to get a sample of his DNA, and that's when they learned he was due to return from Europe on June 9, 2024. They came up with a plan and reached out to airport staff for help. The plan was simple. A border officer pulled Eugene aside for what looked like a routine check. On the table nearby, they'd set out a few bottles of water, and Eugene casually grabbed one. A little later, he tossed the empty bottle into the trash, and detectives moved in right away. They collected it and sent it straight to the lab. Forensic experts swabbed the bottle for DNA and compared it to the genetic material found under Leslie's fingernails. It was a perfect match. That meant one thing. Leslie had scratched Eugene during the attack, leaving his DNA behind at the scene of her murder. With that undeniable evidence, detectives finally had their killer. A few days later, police approached Eugene outside his apartment and placed him under arrest. They brought Eugene in for questioning, and at first the detectives kept things basic, asking when he'd last spoken to his ex-girlfriend or her mother, and whether he'd ever set foot in their house after the breakup. Eugene acted confused, like he didn't even know what they were talking about, and eventually he asked for a lawyer. That's when the detective laid it all out. Eugene's DNA had been found inside the victim's home. Eugene looked stunned. He stammered that he'd never given a DNA sample in his life. Then, his voice shaking, he claimed he couldn't remember anything at all and didn't know what to say.
No, what's wrong with you?
The detectives reminded him that if he wanted to continue with a lawyer, they'd have to wait. Eugene muttered that he didn't know what to do and asked if he could call his girlfriend for help. He was clearly rattled. His hands were trembling, his voice breaking, and then he started to cry.
So you're saying I'm guilty before I've even been put into a court of law?
But the detective noticed something odd. Not a single tear actually rolled down his face.
There's no tears coming out of your face.
She called Eugene out on it right there. Eugene quickly fired back that he was just dehydrated and his eyes were too dry for tears. Moments later, Eugene spiraled into a full-blown meltdown.
My eyes are bloodshot red because I'm just tired and drained. I don't know what's going on.
Accusing the detectives of trying to frame him and insisting yet again that he couldn't remember a thing. After the interrogation, detectives felt even more certain Eugene was guilty. His fake crying and scattered excuses only made things worse. And with so much of his DNA found at the crime scene, they didn't need a confession. So, he was officially charged with first-degree murder. News of his arrest shocked many of his friends and relatives. To them, Eugene had always seemed harmless, upbeat, even generous, a guy who donated to charity and was deeply involved in his community. But not everyone was surprised. One of his ex-girlfriends shared that Eugene would often fly into rages during arguments, hurl objects at her, and punch holes in the walls. His own brother admitted he was genuinely afraid of him, believing Eugene was capable of turning violent. As for Lauren, she was in complete shock. The idea that her ex-boyfriend had murdered her mother was almost impossible to process. She recalled that shortly after the killing, she ran into Eugene and told him what had happened. He hugged her and quietly said, "I'm so sorry." The trial preparation dragged on for almost a year, and by May 2025, prosecutors decided to offer Eugene a deal. Under the terms, he would plead guilty and, in exchange, face second-degree murder instead of first-degree. That charge implied the killing wasn't premeditated, and the maximum sentence was 30 years in prison. Eugene agreed to the deal and admitted guilt. But here's the catch. The plea didn't require him to explain the details of what happened, including his motive. To this day, No one knows why he killed Leslie. Detectives spent countless hours pressing him for answers, but he still refused to talk. Investigators have their theories. The leading one is that it started as a burglary gone wrong. Eugene had been linked to several thefts in the past, so detectives believe that this might have been his original plan. He knew the Jennings home inside and out, making it an easy target. Maybe he assumed no one would be home, but instead came face to face with Leslie. She knew him well, so there was no way he could just walk away unrecognized, and panic could have pushed him to kill her. Still, the theory has holes. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, which raises the question of how Eugene even got inside. One possibility is that he simply knocked, and since Leslie had known him for years, she opened the door without hesitation. From there, he could have attacked her in the hallway. But if robbery wasn't the motive, then why did he do it? And if murder was the plan all along, why didn't he bring a weapon with him? In the end, Eugene's real motive may stay a mystery forever, unless one day he finally decides to tell the whole truth. In late August 2025, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison, but he still never explained why he had killed her. It's also worth noting that once Eugene was caught, the police department came under heavy criticism. The original team of investigators had a tip with his name just a year after the murder. Yet for reasons no one can explain, they never even spoke to him. If they had taken his DNA sample back in 2002, this case might have been solved decades earlier. But of course, the past can't be undone. It's also worth noting that this case went down in history as the very first in Maryland to be solved through genetic genealogy, a method that has since helped crack hundreds of cases all across the country.
Lisa Ann French was born on June 2, 1964, in Wisconsin. When she was young, her parents got divorced, and she moved with her mom to the small town of Fond du Lac. A few years later, her mom remarried, and Lisa became a big sister to a younger brother. By 1973, Lisa was 9 years old, a typical kid attending her local elementary school, active in the Girl Scouts, and spending most of her free time playing outside with friends. That October, Lisa was buzzing with excitement about Halloween, or more specifically, about collecting as much candy as possible from the neighbors. She'd originally planned to dress as a butterfly, but the late October weather turned chilly, forcing her mom to improvise. She pieced together a last-minute costume using clothes from around the house, including an oversized black hat, and sent Lisa out to trick-or-treat. Lisa had planned to go out trick-or-treating with a friend, but that evening she got grounded and had to stay home. So, Lisa set out alone, though her mom warned her not to stray too far from their house. Their neighborhood was considered safe, and Lisa's parents knew everyone within a several-block radius. Plus, other kids and parents were out that night, so her mom wasn't too worried. Lisa was also looking forward to a Halloween party thrown by neighborhood parents. That year, news reports had sparked panic across the country about candy tampering, stories of hidden razor blades, and even poison in treats. To ease fears, the community decided to host a controlled, safe environment for the kids. Lisa left home around 6 p.m., promising to return by 7. But when she didn't come back, her mom started to worry. At first, she figured Lisa had gotten carried away trying to collect as much candy as possible. But when the clock hit 8 p.m., she decided to go look for herself. She combed the nearby streets, but there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, she asked everyone she passed if they'd seen Lisa. Word of the disappearance spread fast through the neighborhood, and soon some neighbors joined the search. But no one could find a trace of her. Eventually, her mom decided to call the police. Officers swarmed the area, and soon dozens of people were out searching, with the crowd growing by the hour. Investigators learned Lisa had only stopped at 2 houses that night, a classmate's and a teacher's. After that, she simply disappeared. This only deepened the fear. Both homes were just minutes from her own, meaning something could have happened almost immediately after she left. The search lasted all night, but turned up nothing. By morning, even more locals joined the effort, and police expanded the hunt citywide. Soon, national news picked up the story. For many, Halloween was supposed to be fun, a night of kids laughing and collecting candy, just like Lisa. Now, her disappearance felt like a collective nightmare, and thousands now wanted answers. The second day of searching turned up nothing, but police weren't ready to give up. They printed thousands of flyers with Lisa's photo, and volunteers plastered them across the town and beyond. Local gas stations even offered free gas to search volunteers, whose numbers eventually swelled to over 5,000 people. They combed every street, forest, field, and river, anywhere Lisa might be. Volunteers on horseback and ATVs scoured remote areas, but no one could find her. Days passed until a call came in on November 3rd, 3 days after Lisa vanished. A farmer driving through the small town of Taikita, just 3 miles from Lisa's home, spotted 2 trash bags by the roadside. Like everyone else, he'd heard about the missing girl, so he decided to check the bags, just in case. What he found horrified him. Inside one bag was Lisa's body. The other held her clothes. The farmer rushed to the nearest phone and called the police. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. By the time officers arrived, dozens of locals had gathered at the scene, all in shock over the grim find. Investigators confirmed the body was Lisa's and sent it to the medical examiner, who established she'd been sexually assaulted. Initially, they thought the cause of death was strangulation, but later determined she'd actually died from shock. Back in 1973, DNA testing wasn't a thing yet, so detectives had to rely on whatever physical evidence they could find. Forensics went through all of Lisa's clothes, picking up stray fibers that seemed out of place. They also found a single hair, but there wasn't a single fingerprint, not on her clothes, not on her body, and not even on the trash bags the killer used to dump her remains. News of the brutal murder didn't just shake their small town, it spread across the whole country. People were outraged, demanding the police catch the killer as soon as possible. Parents were terrified and scared for their own kids' safety. Lisa's funeral took place 3 days after her body was found. Thousands of people showed up for the service, so many that the organizers had to set up multiple lines just to let everyone say their goodbyes. Meanwhile, the police were doing everything they could to track down the killer. With no solid leads, they focused on retracing Lisa's steps that night. 2 families told investigators she'd stopped by their houses for candy, and after that, she just vanished. That meant something had to have happened almost immediately after she left the second house. From there, investigators considered 2 possibilities. Either a stranger saw Lisa outside and lured her away, or she knocked on another door for candy and someone who lived there attacked her. The first theory didn't seem likely. Lisa wasn't the kind of kid to go off with a stranger or to hop into a random car, and none of the neighbors reported hearing screams or seeing anything suspicious. That made the second theory seem much more likely. Investigators went door to door, questioning everyone on the street. There were dozens of houses, but every single resident claimed Lisa hadn't stopped by. With no immediate leads, detectives started looking closer at each household, trying to narrow down possible suspects. They ruled out houses where only women were present, and also eliminated the ones Lisa had already passed before visiting her teacher and classmate. They also knew Lisa had only been knocking on doors of families she knew well. She was familiar with most of her neighbors, but wasn't close with all of them. So, the police asked her mom, who else on that street might Lisa have felt comfortable visiting? She gave them a few names, but one in particular stood out. A little further down the street lived a 24-year-old man named Gerald Turner. He shared a home with his girlfriend and their young daughter. There were several reasons why Turner caught the police's attention. First, Lisa knew him well. He and his family had previously lived in a duplex, with Lisa's family right on the other side of the wall. Their families interacted all the time, and Lisa often ran over to play with his daughter. She also talked to Turner himself quite a bit. She would excitedly bring him new things her parents had bought for her, and he always seemed happy to listen. The second reason had to do with his behavior when police questioned everyone in the neighborhood. He didn't show any obvious signs of guilt, but something about his responses felt off. The detectives couldn't put their finger on it, but his answers just didn't sit right with them. The third reason came to light a little later. Investigators had a pretty clear timeline of when Lisa was attacked, just minutes after she left the last house. And during that exact window, Turner was home alone. His girlfriend and their kid were at a Halloween party, which meant he had the perfect opportunity to commit the crime before they got back. With all this information, Turner seemed like the most likely suspect out of everyone on that street, but proving his guilt was a whole different story. Police questioned him multiple times, but he kept denying any involvement. Eventually, they asked if he'd take a polygraph test, and Turner agreed. During the test, the examiner flagged some of his answers to key questions as inconclusive. Detectives tried to use that to pressure him into confessing, but he wouldn't budge. Later, they asked him to take another test. This time, he flat out refused. With no confession, investigators turned back to the limited physical evidence they had. As we know, forensic experts had found a few stray fibers on Lisa's body and clothing, along with a single human hair. After analyzing it, they conducted the hair most likely wasn't from someone's head. It was from the killer's body. So, police obtained a warrant to search Turner's house and collect hair samples from him. In his bedroom, they immediately took note of the bedspread because it was the same color as the stray fibers found on Lisa's clothing. When forensic experts examined it more closely, they confirmed that the fibers could have come from this blanket, but proving it with absolute certainty just wasn't possible. The hair sample was another frustrating piece of evidence. It matched in color, but without DNA testing, there was no way to prove a definitive match. Still, these findings only deepened their suspicions. Investigators kept pressing Turner, showing up at his house, bringing him in for questioning, but no matter how many times they confronted him, he stuck to his story. He swore he had nothing to do with Lisa's murder. This dragged on for months, and for Lisa's family, it was pure agony. Not only had they suffered an unimaginable loss, but they also had to live with the torment of not knowing who had taken her life. To make things even harder, Lisa's mother was in the early stages of pregnancy at the time of the murder. She was grieving her daughter while also trying to prepare for the arrival of another child. Since Turner continued to deny any involvement, detectives decided to speak with his girlfriend and ask for a more detailed account of that night. She told them that she and her daughter had gone to a Halloween party and returned home around 7:15 p.m. When she walked in, she saw Gerald lying on the couch in his bathrobe. Right away, he told her he wasn't feeling well and just needed to rest. As she sat in the living room, he kept getting up and going to the bedroom, lying down for a moment, then coming back out just as quickly. Each time, he told her not to disturb him and insisted he needed to rest. She found it a little odd, but assumed he really was sick. A short while later, she and her daughter left again to visit her mother. This only added to the police's suspicions about Turner, but they still had no solid proof. That was the case until August 8, 1974, when he was brought in for yet another interrogation. This time, 9 months after the murder, something changed. Turner suddenly decided to confess, and finally told detectives what really happened that night. According to Turner, Lisa had indeed come to his house for candy, and he invited her inside. At that moment, his girlfriend and daughter were still at the Halloween party. From the very first second, he had one thing in mind: assaulting Lisa. So, he took her to the bedroom and committed the crime. Afterward, he realized Lisa wasn't showing any signs of life. He panicked, claiming he never meant to kill her. Turner tried to revive her, but right then, he heard his girlfriend and daughter pulling up outside. Thinking fast, he moved Lisa's body from the bed to the bathroom connected to the bedroom. Then, he went out to the living room and lay down on the couch. As soon as his girlfriend walked in, he told her he wasn't feeling well and asked her not to bother him. Turner then went to the bedroom, hoping she wouldn't follow him, but he couldn't sit still. He was terrified that at any moment, she'd walk in and see what he had done. That's why he kept going back to the living room every few minutes. He knew that if his girlfriend decided to use the bathroom, she'd immediately see Lisa's body, and he was doing everything he could to prevent that. Soon after, his girlfriend left to visit her mother, and Turner started figuring out how to get rid of Lisa's body. He pulled socks over his hands to avoid leaving fingerprints, grabbed 2 trash bags, and stuffed Lisa's body along with her belongings inside. He then carried everything out to his car and drove to a nearby town. There, he dumped the bags by the side of the road and headed back home. By the time Lisa's family and neighbors began searching for her, Turner had already covered his tracks. Turner's confession shocked not just Lisa's family and the town's residents, but even the investigators themselves. For 9 months, they couldn't charge him because the circumstantial evidence simply wasn't enough. But then, out of nowhere, he decided to confess in vivid detail. And most importantly, he gave the police information that no innocent person could have possibly known. After his confession, Turner was arrested, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. It started just a few months later, but the prosecutor faced an unexpected problem. Right before the trial began, Turner recanted his confession. He claimed the police had written it themselves and that he had only signed it because he was exhausted from their constant pressure and harassment. Despite this, there was little doubt about his guilt. Even his ex-girlfriend, who had no idea what had happened at the time, apparently believed he was responsible and testified against him in court. The prosecution also pointed to the fibers found on Lisa's clothing. They matched the bedspread in Turner's bedroom, the very place where he'd taken Lisa. But the strongest piece of evidence was still his confession. It contained far too many specific details to be fabricated. In the end, Turner was found guilty and sentenced to 38.5 years in prison. But his story didn't end there. Despite the horrific nature of his crime, Turner was released early for good behavior. He walked free in 1992 after serving just 17 years behind bars. However, he wasn't released straight back into society. Instead, he was placed in a halfway house, a transitional facility where former inmates live under regular supervision as they adjust to life outside prison. These homes are designed to help with reintegration, offering structure, support, and strict rules to reduce the risk of reoffending. Still, Turner's release sparked massive outrage. Lisa's family was devastated, and the people of Milwaukee, where Turner was relocated, were furious. The idea of such a dangerous criminal living in their community was unacceptable, so residents demanded that authorities remove him immediately. Soon, city and state officials joined the public outcry. While they didn't have the power to forcibly evict Turner, they began pressuring the correction systems to overturn the decision and get him out of Milwaukee. A year after Turner was released, the correction system finally decided to send him back to prison. Their investigation revealed that the parole board had made a mistake. Turner was never supposed to be eligible for early release in the first place. Around the same time, state officials began working on a new law to prevent dangerous criminals like Turner from ever being released again. The law proposed that individuals convicted of sexual assaults who posed a high risk of reoffending wouldn't be sent back into society after serving their time. Instead, they'd be transferred to secure medical facilities and held there until doctors determined they were no longer a threat to others. This law, named after Turner himself, was passed in 1994. Authorities hoped it would block any future attempts by Turner to gain his freedom. But just a few years later, they were hit with another setback. In 1998, Turner once again applied for early release. To everyone's disbelief, the parole board refused to classify him as a dangerous sexual offender, even despite damning testimony during the hearing from Turner's ex-wife and several former girlfriends. Each of them shared similar stories. They said Turner had repeatedly abused them when they refused his advances. But even with these overwhelming testimonies, the board still wasn't convinced. In the end, Turner didn't fall under his own law and was released once again. He moved back into a halfway house, and a few months later, he nearly attacked a parole officer with a knife during a routine check. But even after that, Turner was allowed to remain free. The following year, Turner filed a lawsuit against a waste management company that had refused to hire him. At the time, he was living in Wisconsin, where laws prohibited employers from denying someone a job based solely on their criminal record. Shockingly, the court ruled in Turner's favor, and he was awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the company. This continued until 2003. Turner was still living in a halfway house, with law enforcement regularly checking in on him. During one of these routine visits, officers discovered a massive collection of disturbing adult photos and videos on Turner's computer. They also found out he had been watching 3 movies about serial killers. Under the terms of his parole, Turner was strictly prohibited from possessing or viewing any such materials. As a result, he was immediately arrested, and the judge decided to send him back to prison for 15 years. Lisa's family thought this would finally be the end, that Turner would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But once again, they faced another devastating twist. The parole board refused to extend his sentence, and Turner was scheduled for release in 2018. Lisa's mother refused to accept that Turner might walk free again. She launched a petition demanding to keep him behind bars. The petition quickly gathered thousands of signatures and drew nationwide attention from people who didn't want such a dangerous criminal back in society. Local and state authorities also backed the movement, and together they began working to overturn the decision regarding his release. This time, they once again invoked the law named after Turner, arguing that he should be transferred to a secure psychiatric facility instead of being set free. Naturally, Turner fought back, hiring lawyers to challenge the decision, and the legal battle dragged on for several years. Finally, in 2022, a judge made the final ruling. Turner did fall under the law that bore his name. The court determined that he posed a threat to others, and instead of being released, he was sent to a secure psychiatric facility. But even after this ruling, Turner's lawyers filed an appeal and are still fighting to overturn the decision to this day. As of now, Turner is 75 years old and remains in a psychiatric facility. But despite his age, opponents of his release firmly believe he is still a threat and argue that he should never be allowed back into society under any circumstances. It's also worth noting that while Turner has refused to directly admit his guilt, he made several indirect but convincing confessions over the years. During his initial trial, right before sentencing, he walked past Lisa's mother and quietly said, "I didn't mean to do it." At one point during his time in prison, Turner even wrote a letter addressed to Lisa herself, apologizing and admitting that he had killed her. There was another moment when he let his guilt slip. Turner once said that if he hadn't committed the crime on Halloween, it wouldn't have gotten so much attention from the public and the media, and no one would have cared. Because of all this, Lisa's family knows their fight isn't over. They'll keep battling to make sure Turner never walks free again. And given his history, this latest attempt to get released probably won't be his last. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.